Remember all those debates we had over the FB ref data? Well, it's time to find out just how wrong we were. This is the Arsenal Vision Post-Match Podcast. My name's Elliot Smith. You can block me on Twitter, Yankee Gunner. Yeah, you know, the debates where someone says, I like this player, we should sign that player, and someone else throws up the green bars from FB ref and goes, ha-ha, I can settle the argument with my fancy data that I got from this publicly available website. And everyone goes, what? That doesn't settle the argument. And then they argue more. It's fun. It's a never-ending story. It's a circle of life. But we're about to find out how it's really done because we are going to talk to the former head of analytics at Arsenal, Sarah Rudd. That's right. She was head of analytics at Arsenal, formerly of Stats DNA. Stats DNA, of course, acquired by Arsenal. She became the head of analytics at Arsenal over time, someone with a tremendous background, but also got into it as an Arsenal fan, was an Arsenal fan. You'll hear about that in the interview. It sort of drew her into football analytics. She's now onto another venture, pursuing a similar area, but we're going to keep all of that very hush-hush and top secret. But it's an interview I've really been looking forward to because I think as we try to incorporate data into our process of discussing football, there are always going to be people that say, screw the data. Fair enough. Some people that say the data is dispositive. It is everything. You know, you do you. But there is a happy medium there. There's a way of understanding the value of this information without overstating the value of the information, understanding what it cannot capture and what it does try to capture and how it does that effectively and how it's implemented, and also understanding how it's implemented within clubs and what they may have access to that we don't have access to, if anything. So all of those questions are on the agenda today, along with much more. It is a wide-ranging interview where Sarah just gets to demonstrate her depth of knowledge, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope you will as well. So without further ado, he always says, prior to further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Elliot Smith, master interviewer, but most importantly, to Sarah Rudd. Enjoy. Okay, and so now it is my great pleasure to introduce Sarah Rudd. Hello, Sarah.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. I really appreciate you making time to do this. I know you are extremely busy, but I think there's so much that we can learn from you about analytics in football, maybe a little bit about analytics at Arsenal without stepping on any sensitive topics. But I think a good place to start is just your background in terms of why football analytics and why Arsenal in particular.
Yeah, I mean, so growing up, you know, there wasn't a lot of access to football. And then, you know, when I went to university, this was after the World Cup in '94. My cousin had just randomly chosen Arsenal as a club to support. And he would always be like, hey, let's go to the bar at like 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning and go watch soccer. And I was like, oh, that sounds amazing. And, you know, so this was like the late 90s. And it was just like a really great time to start watching Arsenal. And I just kind of fell in love with them. And then, you know, had the pleasure of watching Bergkamp, but then Henry and Cesc, and just kind of fell in love with them. And then, you know, later on, eventually, as I started thinking about, you know, how can I work in football? How can I kind of make this career transition? I got my hand on some data. And I think the first question I wanted to answer was, does Arsenal really lock it in? And the answer is yes, but so do all the good teams. So, you know, and I think now with the invention of XG, I mean, it's that good teams create better shot opportunities. So no real surprise, but it was kind of, I guess, satisfying to say like, hey, this is kind of an unfair criticism of Arsenal. Like they're just trying to create better shot opportunities. Like that's what a good team should be doing.
It is really sort of unfair, the hiring advantage that football clubs have, because if you love a football club and they offer you a job, you're not going to say no. So I would imagine it's easy to get talented people like yourself to come over there. But you did go over there sort of as part of the Stats DNA operation. And I think one of the sort of early data analysis work that you were doing was on using something called Markov chains. I read what they are and still don't understand them. But in sort of understanding what they may have presaged for you in terms of data, it looks a little bit like expected threat now in terms of trying to predict how these unrelated data points or seemingly unrelated data points lead to a better opportunity to either lose possession or create a goal. Very, you know, an easy binary, right? In terms of what can happen in football. You either lose possession or you score a goal. But what this led me to think about is how much data has evolved in football, because coming from American sports, I think data has been around in American sports for a long time and been embraced by American sports. Is there a reason you think that it's been later to come to football and maybe harder to develop? Is there something unique about football you find that makes it a bigger challenge from a data standpoint than maybe some of the American sports where data is much more familiar?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of factors that have led to kind of the delayed uptake. The first one is, I think, the criticism that it's just too fluid. And, that's true in a sense, but if you look at hockey or basketball, those are quite fluid, dynamic sports. But then, soccer has the complexity of, 22 players on the pitch rather than, 10 or 12, whatever it is. So it's just a little bit more complex. But I think, really the biggest issue has been that added context around what's happening in the event. So going from, I passed the ball from this location to that location to, what you're seeing providers like StatsBomb adding now where they say, okay, well, I passed the ball to you, but you were under pressure, or, here are the location of the players around you, so that you can kind of add a little bit more context to things and things start making more sense. Early on, there were these kind of nonsensical debates around whether pass completion or possession was like a meaningful statistic. And, I think everybody was in agreement that no, it's not. You can be a good team and maintain possession, but never threaten the goal. And so without that context, it's hard to discern between a team that's just passing the ball around in their own half versus a team that's kind of pushing the ball forward, breaking lines, destabilizing the defense and creating opportunities. So, I think that's been one of the advances over the years that's really helped kind of take it to the next level. And, that was one of the big, appealing things for Arsenal, is that StatDNA was collecting this very unique type of context around the events at a time when nobody else was really doing it. And so we could kind of set ourselves apart and say, like, yeah, I can figure out, like, this was a pass that split three defenders and put you in one-on-one on goal, versus you're still facing, two blocks of four. You're not going to score from there. So, I think at the heart of a lot of these discussions about why you can't use stats, it's really around just missing that type of context. And so, as technology changes, you're able to just add more of that information and realize that you're actually talking about the same types of issues.
So if you think you have better data than maybe other organizations have, and you go to a football club and you want to pitch them on your data, obviously you're going to talk about why you may be able to capture what's happening on the pitch better than other solutions do. But what I'm curious about is then, what's the pitch in terms of how that helps the club? I think what most lay people like myself use data for is to have really fun and totally productive arguments about transfers. But I'm sure that there are myriad ways that clubs can use superior data to create an edge. And obviously all of this is just about an edge in the market, an edge on the pitch, an edge in preparation. So what are some of the ways that the superior data is implemented? Like when StatsDNA is going to Arsenal and saying, you should hire us, we can make you better. Is it predominantly about transfer targets? Is it attempting to help with other aspects like tactical preparation? What are some of the ways that we might be surprised to know that data is being used, or at least being pitched to be used, to improve the performance of these clubs?
Yeah, I mean, I think still and probably forever, the highest leverage situation is going to be using it for transfers, whether it's bringing someone in or saying no to someone, because those are the most expensive decisions a football club is going to make year in, year out. And so probably that's like the best starting point for every football club when they are interested in incorporating data into their process. But there's, probably a standard number of areas that they would go from there. So doing opposition analysis, helping the team prepare for their upcoming opponent. This is something that you would typically have video analysts working on, but you can get a longer term view, or maybe a slightly different perspective if you start bringing in data into that process. Similarly, you can do like a post-match review where you try to objectively understand your your team's performance. I mean, the coaching staff, they're going to have their opinions. But we all know that like in the heat of battle, those opinions are going to be really biased. So having this data report to kind of take a little bit of the emotion out of it is something that you'll see at a lot of clubs. And then, they might do that in terms of like periodic reviews, which will then feed into like squad needs, which would then feed into recruitment. And then another area, which is probably one that has a lot of uptake, is sports science, because the practitioners there, they're used to numbers, they're used to data. So they're a bit hungry for someone to come in and help them out and say like, hey, how can we help reduce injuries? Like, how can we understand if we're maximizing performance? Like, what can you tell us about, the busy period and, how tired our players are going to get or how much we should rotate. So that's like another big area where you'll tend to see a lot of uptake from the data side.
Interesting. And so with all of those ways that data can be used to create leverage, obviously there has to be an agreement within the organization to use the data in that way. And I would imagine that now within football clubs, you are going to find less resistance than maybe 10 years ago. Can you maybe expand on the evolution of the willingness and the willingness to use this data and the ease with which it can be incorporated in the process? Like, do you find that today it's almost presumed that this data will be incorporated in all of these ways versus when you started, it had to be sold to the manager or the director of football? There wasn't really a director of football at Arsenal at that time. How has that evolved in terms of the battle internally to have a seat at the table and use the data to its greatest effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on, like you had to do a lot of education, and certainly there would be people who were resistant versus people who, were a little bit more willing to sit down and listen and try to educate themselves. But, if you take XG, like that was a really new concept 10 years ago. Nowadays, you could probably walk into a room with almost anybody working in football and they'll at least have heard of it. They might not have a lot of faith in it.
It's in the latest FIFA video game, for God's sake. I mean, it's terrible, but it's in there.
Yeah. And so like, that straight ahead just makes your life a whole lot easier. And then you can, talk to them about it and understand that like, it's not, trying to say like you're stupid. It's basically trying to put a number to what you already intuitively know. Like people know what a good shot opportunity is. And you can ask them like, oh, how likely is that guy to score? And they'll be able to assign a rating to it. It might not be consistent, but they can do that. And so you can have conversations like that are a little bit disarming to them and say like, look, we're trying to do the same thing, just via different methods. But like, from a footballing perspective, like we're on the same page. And, I think one thing that really helped us in the early days is doing a lot of listening to what their criticisms were and then trying to address them. But then also really making sure that, from a footballing perspective, everything made sense. Like if they wanted to know why was this labeled a good pass and not that one, like you had to be able to explain it to them. So from a data science perspective, like having very interpretable models was important so that you could have that conversation with them. But, oftentimes having those discussions, you would say, oh, there's actually like a feature missing from this model. Like we need to account for this situation. And so that's really good because then they feel ownership over the model as well. Like they helped build it and they'll want to use it. So I think, just having those kind of open conversations, and I understand like that's not always possible at every football club with every person. But really, what I've found successful is there's always going to be that one person that you'll never convince, and you shouldn't waste your time trying to convince them. Instead, you should go to the person who's willing to engage in those conversations and have that talk with you. Because, at the end of the day, like you're all on the same team. And I think there's always going to be people that are hungry to find something that's going to help them do their job better. So they'll be willing to engage on that. And, I think the last component is like video is such like a invaluable tool. it's really kind of like the best way to speak the same language with everyone, where you just sit down and watch clips over and over again and say, like, this is what the model says. What do you think? And that way, like, you're taking something from the abstract and putting it into the concrete, and they can, I think, really see like how things are working because they're used to watching video. So yeah, it's really progressed, I guess, over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I guess the willingness to incorporate it then also requires a responsibility to use the data in the way it's most effective. And I think, so it's interesting. The Athletic did their football tactics podcast, did an interview with MK Dons sporting director, Liam Sweeting, and they use data a lot in their process. And he was talking about recruitment and the different ways that data can be used in recruitment. And that, I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think there was sort of the suggestion that the wrong way is that the club finds the targets that they want to bring in and then says to the analytics department, sort of, show me the data on this player that I will then use to confirm that I've got the right idea. Whereas Liam Sweeting was saying, we use the data to narrow the field down. And then once we have the targets the data likes, we go and look at them. I'm curious if, firstly, if you agree that that sort of second way is the way that data can be most impactful, and the limitations of data at that level in terms of data can maybe show you, narrow the pool to the players that are closer to what you might want, but then, it's not intended to replace then going and looking at what they actually are. I mean, I think there are a lot of people that worry that what we're trying to say with data is, it replaces you having to use your eyes to watch football. I don't think that statement's ever been made, but somehow it's an accusation that's levied. So is that the right way to let the data narrow the pool and then go see if the resulting pool of players is appropriate?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways you could incorporate it into your decision-making process. I think the first process you outlined, where the club has already essentially made their decision and just wants the data to confirm or reject, that's incredibly dangerous because the data isn't perfect either. And everybody should be like quite critical of what the data is saying and quite aware of its limitations and shortcomings. And so if you've already kind of come into the process with a decision made and you really like a player, you'll find a reason not to believe what the data is saying. And at that point, like, why bother? Like, you're just going to do what you were going to do anyway. So,
or you can do the p hacking, right? Where you're like, oh, well, here's some data that shows me what I wanted to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's just, you're setting yourself up for failure by kind of not realizing how you should be doing it. Mm-hmm. So, the narrowing of the funnel, I think, is a much more common situation these days. And, it has its limitations as well, like particularly around defenders. It's quite difficult to flag up defenders via data. So
I had that as a question, so I'm glad you went to
it. Yeah. So, you have to be careful there as well. And like, I don't think it's we're going to start with the data and then have the scouts look at them. It has to be some sort of combination. And what you really want is like a healthy discussion between those two departments, rather than, I think, what Moneyball showed, which is like confrontation and everything. No, like, I don't think that's how you want to do it in the modern world. I think the modern world, you want those two departments working together and understanding, like, this is what I'm seeing, this is what you're seeing, like, how can we overlap? How can we confirm each other? Or, should we flag this up as debate? And, kind of a follow-up from there. So, there's no right model, I think, because it is so dependent on how the club at large is kind of structured. So there's a lot of different ways that you can be, I guess, successful without necessarily doing it one way or the other. It really depends on, I think, your structure, like not just structure within recruitment, but then, how does the manager fit in? How does the technical director, if you have one, fit in? How does the board fit in? Because those are all people that want information to make the decision as well. So you need to be able to kind of incorporate that into how you're structuring things and say, like, what's the right level of information to give to each person at what point in the process? Because I think, another thing is that recruitment doesn't happen in a day. Like, it's a continuous cycle. So there's going to be different points throughout that cycle where you're going to want to bring it in.
Yeah, I mean, the defender thing is fascinating to me because I also think it shows I don't want to say flaw in data, but the evolution of data. Like I'll use Shodran Mustafi as an example and not just as a punching bag, but obviously a defender that didn't really work out at Arsenal. I think it's fair to say he was a dominant defender on counting stats. And I'm not going to ask you to answer this because, I certainly don't want to implicate anything, but I sort of have always wondered, did those counting stats weigh in on the decision to go after him, for example, because, tackles, headers, he just anything that could be measured, he measured well on, but the things that can't be measured, obviously he didn't do well on. I'm wondering, is that sort of is that the white space for data in football, is trying to assign value to things where no event occurs, the ability to be in the right space to receive a pass, or the ability to be positioned between the ball and between the goal and the man, or I don't know how to articulate this, which explains how hard it would be to measure. But one thing that I know with football is there are a lot of firms now trying to do these tracking data and get better positional information, and that's only as good as the cameras that are set up. And I think Liverpool works with a company, I'm not sure if Arsenal does, that sets up a camera array at Anfield and at the training ground to try to better capture the position of each player. Is this the next sort of new frontier for data to maybe even using machine learning to identify positions taken up by players where no action is occurring and trying to quantify the value of things that don't have a specific action associated with them? I don't know if I've explained that well, but maybe you can turn it into a brilliant question with a brilliant answer.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, and that's been one of the biggest criticism of stats for so long, is that so much of the game of football happens off the ball. And we're only looking at what happens on the ball with these traditional event data sets. And so this is kind of the great hope with this tracking data. So I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but Premier League clubs have had access to tracking data for every game in the Premier League going back to the 2015-16 season. So clubs are able to get a lot of information from this type of data set, but it's still unbelievably difficult because, if you take a defender and let's say it's an aggressive center back, so they have great counting stats, one of the areas of weakness for them might be decision making, where they overcommit to a tackle when they should have just stayed on their feet and let the play develop. Even with tracking data, building a model to say like, yes or no, you made the right decision here is just unbelievably difficult. So yes, like that's the frontier that everybody would love to go into and fix and, solve that problem, but it's unbelievably difficult. And then, with a transfer of a center back like that, there's another complication on top of that, which is, they've been performing at a certain level, at a certain team, in a certain league, in a certain style of play with a certain center back partner. How are they going to come into Arsenal and how are they going to perform? And that's, again, something that's unbelievably complex. And it's just getting, I think, worse as, we're starting to see more and more tactical variations. So the proliferation of a back five over the last 2 years really makes, assessing the performance of center backs and wing backs or / fullbacks incredibly difficult, because now you're not just talking about moving from a team or a league, but like a completely different style of defending. And then, certainly within a back five, like there's many different ways to defend. So, it's quite complex, and there's a long way to go before people really nail it, which I think too just kind of like reiterates the point of like, you can't just rely on the data. Like you have to use human beings still, because human beings are a lot better, like particularly when you have really smart, experienced scouts or coaching staff that can say like, no, he really should have just like waited a half second more before making the tackle. Like when they can see that, it's unbelievably helpful, because I'm not smart enough to do that.
Yeah, well, I think it's particularly relevant even now with Arsenal, because I know when we signed Benjamin White, my concern was, well, here's a guy that was playing in System A, doing X, Y, and Z jobs. And now it looks like he's going to go into system B, maybe doing A, B, and C jobs that are different. How do you draw a line between these two roles and analyze whether he'll be effective at them? And then you have the problem, the opacity of, well, maybe the coach has a role specifically in mind for him that will be more similar to what he did in this other system. And you have all of these layers of complexity and variables that I don't think the data has any ability right now in its current state to capture. There's certainly, I think there are data points that are stickier. I tend to think they show up more with attacking players than they do defenders. So it'd be interesting to see how that evolves. One question that I think a lot of people will have, by the way, and because this leads to a lot of arguments too. Anytime I think someone uses publicly available data and video, even video that's not totally publicly available, but sort of publicly available, like we have a Y-Scout account. We use Y-Scout video to do our scouting and analytics podcasts. And like the combination of Y-Scout data and what StatsBomb puts out through FBref and things like that, we think we're able to do a pretty interesting job analyzing stuff. I mean, you look at a guy like Tom Warville, for example, who was the analytics writer for The Athletic. He's just been hired to run the analytics department for Red Bull, for RB Leipzig, right? There's a lot of stories of people doing public facing work, winding up in football through that work. So I'm curious how different you think the models and the video and the resources available to the public are versus what clubs are working with for someone who says like, oh, well, obviously the clubs have access to stuff you don't. How much stuff do the clubs have? And I realize that's the edge, right? That's the edge that a Stats DNA or someone else tries to bring to the club to say, we can create a model for you that is better than other models, that is different. But how different do you think it is? How close is the distance between publicly available data and video tools versus what clubs are working with generally?
Yeah, I think there's a couple big differences. I mean, so StatDNA, we were kind of a unique situation in that, Arsenal acquired their whole data company. So we were able to collect, whatever data. We could change the specification of the data we were collecting based on whatever requirement we had. Whereas, most other clubs and certainly people in the public, you have no control over that. If you want to know whether they hit it with, the laces or the instep, like that's not something you can just go to StatsBomb and say, hey, can you start collecting this for me?
Interesting.
Not that we collected that, by the way.
No, I get it. Yeah, I get your point.
That's kind of a rarity. I think some of the clubs that are owned by betting companies, they'll have similar setups where they're collecting a little bit more information, but it's definitely the exception, not the norm. But in terms of, for, let's say, your average football club compared to the public, one of the big differences is they're going to have access to like the raw event information, which you can't get from FBref. And why that's important is you can build kind of more complex metrics or models on top of that. So, let's say hypothetically you wanted to know like how many times did a team, attack or like get into the box after a switch of play. Like that's something you could only do with the raw data, not from kind of the pre-aggregated data that most public people have access to. The other big difference, as we kind of mentioned earlier, is the tracking data. So that's a big tool for a lot of the clubs that they've had access to for years and years and years. So they're going to be way beyond the public who just now in like the last year or two have been getting access to, a small sample of tracking data files, but certainly not like a comprehensive season. And I think, beyond just like the raw data sources that you have access to, I think there's two big differences. One is this is what people are doing for their, full-time job. So they're going to have a lot more time to think about these things and develop the models. So that's why, I think the common perception is that clubs are ahead of the public. They just have more people thinking and doing work on this type of data. And then the other big difference, I think, is that they're going to have access to the coaching staff and understand, like, well, what's the context behind this situation? Like, what were your objectives for this match? Were we able to meet them? You can, I can't think of a good example now, but, an outsider could view a game as kind of a poor performance because the team lost, whereas the coaching staff might say, like, we played to the game plan, we hit all of our KPIs, we just got unlucky. So for them, they might view that as, not a successful game, but not the end of the world because the underlying performance was good. And that's the type of analysis that's really difficult to do as an outsider, not really understanding what the team's objective were for that day. And I think, the same goes for recruitment, where people don't necessarily have the context around the long-term strategic plan of the club in terms of, why are you renewing this person and not selling them? There's oftentimes a lot more context within the club that might make that opinion or that decision seem a little bit less foolish.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One thing that leads me to also, by the way, for people who are not initiated with acronyms, KPIs, key performance indicators, right?
Yep.
I think hopefully I'm right. There's this dance that I feel like analytics and data has to do to be accepted, where it has to be sold in a way that non-technical people can digest it. But in doing that, there's the risk of contaminating it in a sense that it winds up being used wrong. 2 examples, radars, right? These radar or spider charts.
Yeah.
Radars are very popular because they're very visual, but radars, depending on how the data is laid out, can give a misleading picture of a player or of a situation or a club. And then another example is expected goals. Expected goals can be a really powerful tool, but it's now something that's being used literally like not just game by game, like half by half. You have accounts tweeting out what the XG at halftime was. And I get that it's a neat shorthand to sort of understand something, but I also don't think that XG was intended to be used, in single game form, let alone a half. So do you think that there is this challenge of needing to package data so that it can be not just understood, but adopted by the wider footballing community? But in doing that sometimes there's a danger of it being used wrong, which then undermines the data because people can point to it and say that doesn't make sense. So like, how do you, first of all, maybe I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, just tell me, but do you think that there is that tension of the data becoming more widely adopted, but in doing so, maybe being used in a way it's not intended to be?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a danger. And, I think anybody who's going to go work for a club, the first thing they need to do is go on kind of an education campaign.
Yeah.
I think, we're at the point now where publicly available data is so accessible that, even if maybe your club doesn't have accounts with a data provider, like people are going on the internet and kind of doing their own rogue data science without necessarily understanding fully what they're doing. And so I think it's really important that like there are these kind of education processes in place with the key decision makers in terms of like, this is how much we should read into this number. This is how much we should be panicking if we have a low XG one game, don't panic at all. But, trying to stay ahead of it, because I think the danger now is a lot of people are very eager. Like they want to do their jobs really well. And so they'll, like, if they don't have access to the resources of like a, experienced data scientist, they'll go out on their own and start playing around with things in kind of these dangerous manners. And the data providers themselves aren't helping because everybody has their own XG model and they don't really want to talk about why their model is better or worse. Well, they probably want to talk about why their model is better, but never want to talk about why their model is worse than the other person. And so people don't necessarily understand the difference and why you should trust one data provider more than another. Like XG isn't like batting average in baseball where there's like a universal truth. Like that number can vary quite a bit depending on who you're getting the data from and what model they're using. And I don't think people take that seriously enough. So that's, I think a big concern for the industry going forward. And, that can set things back a lot, where if you're making decisions on bad data because you don't fully understand what it means, then you're going to say, like, why am I bothering with this at all? Which is, quite unfortunate. But, I think as the industry develops, like there's going to be more and more people embedded in clubs that have the background and the knowledge to help help educate people.
Yeah, and I won't take up too much of your time. I really do appreciate it. Just a couple of quick things. One thing in terms of sample size, like I always hear the data community being really careful to point out that small sample sizes are dangerous. And then you'll hear the comment like, even one season is a small sample size. And there's a part of me that's like, yes, I totally understand that from a data standpoint. But you can't tell a club that, right? You can't go to a club and be like, don't worry, I know you almost got relegated this season. All your players are terrible. But the data is not confirming anything yet because it's small samples. They need answers that fit into season-long packages. And I'm wondering, like, is that sort of a problem? Because, you mentioned baseball. I mean, you have 182 games. You can have, hundreds and hundreds of at-bats for a player, for example, to not only create these truths like batting average, but to look at stats that are really predictive and really reliable because of the sample size. I mean, it is sort of incumbent upon the data scientists working at clubs to provide answers in a shorter window. Otherwise, what's the point, right? I mean, is that a big problem? Because you really can't tell the club, hey, don't worry, 3 seasons from now, I'll definitely be able to tell you what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem, and it's why I often refer to what I do as an art more than a science. You're never going to have as much data as you want because there's always going to be some sort of context or something where you want to split what little data you have into even smaller samples. So if you take, for example, let's say you want to get a player from Eredivisie or Portugal, the quality of opposition in those leagues varies significantly, where there's going to be a handful of teams that are, top tier quality, and then the rest of the teams are pretty low. So, you have to make a decision about how you want to handle that. Do you only focus on the games where they're playing high quality opposition, or do you use everything and say this is more information, but we know it's going to be skewed slightly in favor of this player because they're playing such low opposition? So there's, 1,000 decisions like that you have to make every day. I think one really powerful thing is to say, like, I don't know. There's definitely going to be situations where it's unclear, you don't have enough data, and you just can't really say one way or the other. But more often than not, you're kind of working with people and say, like, yes, this is imperfect data. We would love to have more, but given this limited data, it's better than nothing. Let's, think about what this means. Think about factors that could be altering this or, whatnot. And I think, again, this comes back to working with the scouts, because scouts have an even smaller sample size, right? Like, they're only going to watch a player a handful of times, if that. And so how can you kind of, supplement each other to come up with an answer? But, this is why nobody is perfect in the transfer market. Everybody is going to make mistakes, but you just want to get your process to be better than it was before. So it's not striving for perfection; it's striving for improvement.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, the club that obviously I point to a lot, and people hate hearing it, and it's one they could point to a lot, what Liverpool have achieved. Do you think that people over-index that success as being some like holy grail for data, for analytics success? I mean, like, they did have a lot of things sort of break right for them. When I look at clubs like Brentford and Brighton and MK Dons and clubs that are using data at lower levels of football to create an edge, I think there's more edge to be found at that level, right? Because one really good player that was under the radar that you find can move the needle massively. When you're trying to go from 5th to 1st in the Premier League, I don't think that edge is as significant, but Liverpool stand in opposition to that hypothesis. So how do you think about the diminishing returns of data at the most elite levels, and in particular the paragon that is Liverpool in terms of what they've accomplished, and whether that's maybe overstated?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly what Liverpool have accomplished is amazing and something that a lot of teams should look to. I don't know how much of that can be attributed to analytics, but rather just a holistic process, right? Like, they had the courage and conviction to sell Coutinho at a high, that, like, a lot of clubs, I think, would have held on to him a little bit more and said, no, he's kind of key to us. Like, we're scared to lose him. And then they just reinvested that money really smartly. And they did that, over and over again, selling players at their peak, when most clubs I think would have been scared to do that. So I think they have a really good process, and there's obviously going to be a lot of luck that plays into this type of success. I think what's going to be interesting is how they can sustain that level of success. I think this is where a lot of teams have always struggled. How can you not just do it once, but then sustain that level of competitiveness in the squad so that you're perennially fighting for the title. So I think that's still to be seen. But in terms of where the edges for teams, like Liverpool is competing with City, and they again have a very good analytics department, but it's much easier for them to say, like, we're going to buy 3 players at £60 million, and if we make a mistake with one of them, we still have these 2 other amazing athletes. So there's a little bit less of an edge there. But yeah, I mean, I think clubs like Brighton and Brentford, they're probably what most clubs would want to look towards in terms of overachieving for the resources, financial resources that they have, and doing it pretty consistently. I mean, Brentford's rise from the Championship to Premier League is just astonishing. And Brighton, what they're doing this season, it's been a long time coming. And again, can they sustain it? That's yet to be seen. But I think they're both doing, pretty good jobs. And I wouldn't be surprised if they have, great internal structures in terms of decision making.
Yeah, and I think what's hard is if you rewind 10 years and you say there's going to be one club using analytics and none of the other clubs are going to be using it, well, then you have an incredible edge. But then if you fast forward 10 years and you say there are 20 clubs in the Premier League and 19 of them are using analytics, sure, some of the departments are going to be better than others. Some of the data scientists are going to be better than others. But great data scientists providing useful information that's integrated into the way the club operates versus pretty good data scientists providing pretty good information that's being integrated in the way the club operates, that's not the same edge as one club using it and one club not, if that makes sense. And so I just think the margins narrow because these clubs are so much sharper than they used to be. And that's my perception. I mean, do you think I'm giving them too much credit? It feels to me like all of these clubs are getting sharper, but maybe they just have more money and I'm misinterpreting that as being sharper. It sure looks like it to me.
No, I would absolutely agree. And when you kind of look at the transfers, in and out of the Premier League, I think, 5 years ago, you could be like, oh my God, like, what are these guys doing? How can they be paying that much money for this guy that we know is terrible? Whereas now, I think you can look at most teams' recruitment and be like, yep, I disagree with this a little bit, but I don't hate it.
But I get it. I get the process, the methodology. And by the way, I think you said something really important about admitting what you don't know. If there is one thing that I think turns people off to data, people that are not predisposed to loving it, I'm talking about fans now, it's being told, I know what's right because I looked at data and you didn't. I think people hate the perception that data solved football and that if you aren't looking at it as your primary piece of your process in watching football and analyzing football, then you're a rube and you don't know what you're talking about. And I do think that has been off-putting to some people that are like, well, I watch a lot of football and I feel like I know football. And then, some people that say, well, I look at the data and you don't know what you're talking about. And so I think resisting the very sort of toxic instinct to somehow hold yourself up as a better fan or a more knowledgeable fan because you can go to fbref.com, I think is pretty important just in terms of people feeling more at ease with this stuff. I guess if you could blink into existence the next big breakthrough in data, and if you can't answer this because it's what you're working on now and you don't want to give away a secret, fair enough. But like, is there your dream question to answer, a problem to solve? One thing I always thought that would be super fun to have in football would be like the WAR stat in baseball, wins above replacement, right? This idea of a replacement level player and measuring a player against that. It's so hard to create a baseline, but that baseline is so valuable in terms of talking about, what that player adds or detracts. I mean, is there something like that you'd love to see, or sort of a wish list you have of the next breakthrough?
Yeah, I mean, I think the $1 million or maybe $1 billion question that a lot of people are trying to answer that's still really difficult is, what happens when I take this player from this environment and put them elsewhere? There's certain tools in place to help you, but none of them that are like particularly accurate where you can say like, yes, I'm very confident that if we spend 80 million pounds on this player, they're going to be lights out. So I think for me, for a lot of people, that's probably like the biggest question left to answer or answer more accurately.
Fair enough. All right. Can I trouble you for a Santi Cazorla anecdote before you go or no?
Oh, yeah. So I guess like, talking about, how much people, I guess, are resistant to stats. I just remember one day reading on some online forum, like, oh, stats can never, quantify like the beauty of Santi Cazorla, like splitting two defenders and putting it right on, the player's foot. And I was just, looking at the data I had and I was like, oh, I can just, with a click of a button, pull up 50 clips of exactly that situation because like, that's exactly what we're doing. Like, I love Santi Cazorla and I would absolutely want to attribute to him as much creativity and success. And, I think that's the difference between, just the kind of really basic stats that people hate, like pass completion versus kind of the more advanced, complicated models that we're starting to see now.
That's really cool. Did you worry about that in any respect? Like one thing that Clive, who's on our pod, has talked about is like, are we getting to a point or going to reach a point where players get savvy and they say, hey, these are 3 stats I know that really pop when people are looking at the transfer market, and I can hack these. Like I can play a more progressive path. Like is there a possibility that players, as they become more familiar with the data being used to evaluate them, will target that data? And is that even a bad thing if it makes them a better player, if that makes sense? Like can players hack this and sort of make themselves look better on a spreadsheet?
Yeah, I mean, that was something I used to worry about. I don't think it's as much of a concern right now. And so, for something like, playing progressive passes or something like that, like we'll also look at retention. So having this kind of like balanced scorecard for a player where it's like, if you get into the final third and you're just always trying to play that killer pass because if it comes off, it'll look really good for the transfer market, like you'll get penalized for all those times you just gave away the ball. So I think for clever clubs, it would be difficult to game.
Interesting. All right. Well, I've kept you a lot longer than I intended, and I appreciate you not just disconnecting in rage quitting, as they might say in the video game language. I love this conversation. I love hearing your approach to it. I thank you for the time you spent at the club and how wonderful that must have been to work at the club you love. I mean, I know you don't want to go too much into Arsenal anecdotes, but I'm sure that was a real joy to be able to be a part of the club every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally a dream come true.
Yeah, that's so cool to hear. And we will wait with bated breath for your next big breakthrough, solving those big mysteries and answering the $1 billion question. And when you do, if you need to break off any of that $1 billion and spend it somewhere, and there's any way that we can be a part of that, we'd be delighted to help you spend your $1 billion somehow. So good luck with that. Sarah Rudd, again, former head of analytics at Arsenal, currently doing things that I have been sworn to secrecy about, but which will come to light in time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We will definitely have more. There'll be a regular podcast previewing the Liverpool match. There will be a live stream on Friday and just so much more. Don't forget to get your thoughts in to the voicemail box if you're a patron, so we can get your thoughts about the Liverpool match into the next podcast as well. You can find that information over on the Patreon side of things. But wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I hope you're safe. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're happy. We love you so much for being here, and we'll continue to try to put out all different kinds of interviews and content and episodes and shows and things that are hopefully enriching and informative and helpful and just make our journey together as Arsenal fans interesting. So I hope you're doing well. We love you, and we will talk to you after Arsenal 10, Liverpool 0.